Okay, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This is my Israel monthly briefing. And as ever, I'm joined by our in-house analyst, Mr. Yaakov Lappin, who is a dear friend of mine from my days at university. He's also the in-house analyst here at the MirYam Institute. And he is ready to discuss a number of issues, much of which will be based upon his briefing that he prepared and that you can read online, his monthly briefing, which is featured there in our commentary section. And we're just going to get the conversation rolling as ever. This is supposed to be less formal in tone, and I look forward to having a back and forth with Yaakov. I'm sure we'll agree on some things, possibly have areas of discord on other things, but always it's a pleasure for me to be with you, Yaakov. Thanks a lot for joining.
Likewise, Benjamin, it's always a pleasure for me too.
So it's wonderful to be having this webinar with you from here in Israel. It's really a pleasure to be back here. And I've come back here, Yaakov, just after the ceasefire was brokered between Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And I have to tell you, I was driving around the streets here thinking that the frenetic pace that I always associate with life here in Israel is somewhat amiss, somewhat muted. I didn't think in a negative way. I actually thought that the atmosphere was rather relaxed compared to what I'd expected. And I thought that that was a very, very positive feeling. But just before we came on air, you mentioned to me that there is, of course, and I ought to have considered this as, of course, fatigue among the population, somewhat following the 5 days of hostility between Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. How do you sense the atmosphere now in Israel?
I think fatigue is the right word. It would definitely sum up what I personally am feeling. Obviously, people like me whose work is directly affected by the security situation, as a journalist covering military affairs, will experience a lot of fatigue. And, people who are serving in the armed forces and in the Air Force will experience far more fatigue. But the general population was targeted during this escalation deliberately and strategically, and therefore it was kept on edge. It was terrorized. It was the target of 1,500 rocket attacks coming out of the Gaza Strip fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And aside from the physical dangers of that situation, the more prominent experience for most Israelis was the psychological effect. It's essentially a terror organization using Israel's own air alert and siren system against the population. Because when you hear the siren and you have to go with your family into the safe room, your adrenaline's going to go up, even if you've done this 100 times, as people in the South say, it's a natural response. So the adrenaline's going to shoot up and then it's going to start coming down, and then to be on edge waiting for this to happen again. Experience is draining, and it's designed to be draining. So that would explain the fatigue. I think I personally feel it, and I'm sure that many other people do, but Israelis are a resilient bunch, and I'm sure that within a few days things are going to be fully back to normal.
So I can expect to hear the horns being blown here by the cars as normal, and
you should be hearing that now. If you're not hearing that now, I'd be worried.
So I have barely heard it since I got here.
Interesting.
Barely heard it, and I've sensed a degree of calm that I've not really encountered here before. So it's very interesting to me. I'm wondering. I actually was wondering, Yaakov, if it might have been a consequence of the pause on judicial reform. What do you think about that? Because that really was causing a lot of uproar on either side of the argument, on either side of the debate, and it crisscrossed the country. It crisscrossed political divides and political allegiances. And I wonder if the pause more relaxed atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, the pause has been in place, I think approximately for the better part of a month, more than. And ever since the negotiations at, the president's residence began between the opposition and the coalition, it became clear that the street movement, the protest movement, needed to take things down a notch. The numbers started to get, there was a period at the beginning where even though the negotiations were going on, there were still hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets. But Eventually it starts to taper off because nobody knows where this is going. And the possibility that there will be no judicial reform to speak of is now on the table just as much as the possibility of there being some version of it. So people are adopting a wait and see attitude. There was an attempt right before this escalation by some of the protest organizers to organize a day of disruption, they called it, and very few people turned out for that. And then they sort of got the message, okay, we need to go into wait and see mode. On Saturday night, there are still big protests, in Tel Aviv and Kaplan Street, which is the epicenter of the protest movement. But I think that a lot of people, even though they're very concerned still about where this might go, are less motivated now to hit the streets. And that has definitely decreased tensions within society, which is a good thing.
So going back to what we spoke about just a moment ago, the notion that hearing the sirens ring out and wail out is something that in and of itself actually terrorizes the Israeli population, who have to listen to those sirens and immediately take action, or in the streets or wherever they may be.
Yeah.
That notion became a very harsh reality in your own life, because just a few hundred meters from your home, there was a projectile that was launched from the Gaza Strip, landed in Rehovot, killed an individual, a resident of Rehovot, had a direct hit on a residence in Rehovot. What did that feel like to you? Is that the first time that you have experienced things at such close quarters? And talk to me about how it impacted you, not necessarily as a military analyst, but rather as a father and as a husband and as a citizen of the state of Israel.
So it's not the first time for me personally, because, I've been, chasing rockets, so to speak, for the better part of a decade. But certainly as a resident of Rehovot, taking shelter with my family. And I should say that just before that attack, there was a debate going on in the chat of the soccer parents about whether, we should go ahead with soccer practice for our kids or not. And I saw that PIJ was making threats, that it was determined to fire on central Israel, that it was talking about longer range projectiles. And all I did was really put two and two together. And I said, listen, we shouldn't be having soccer practice, period. I would suggest, my son's not going to go. And I would suggest that none of your children go too. And kids stayed home. And then, afterwards, after that attack, people were writing in saying, wow. And really all I did, and I'm saying this, with full modesty, is I listened to the threats that were coming out of Gaza. And they were clearly intent on trying desperately to obtain what they call a victory picture, which up until then they had not reached. They had lost their senior command in a series of targeted strikes. And they were being eliminated at the tactical level with one strike after another. So they felt the PIJ, in their world, a victory picture is killing Israeli civilians. That is what a victory picture looks like for Palestinian Islamic Jihad and for Hamas when it's involved in escalations too. And you mentioned, how does it look to me as a military as a resident and a father versus a military analyst? But the thing is that it all fuses together, because when I spoke to people afterwards, and I went to the scene of the crash, I saw people emerging from the street shell shocked. I also saw the community come together and people giving water to each other and speaking supportively to one another, and I saw real community spirit in Rehovot. The municipality put up the people in a hotel, and people organized a Shabbat dinner for them the night after, because the strike was on Thursday. So it all fused together, because you hear as a military analyst all the time that Iron Dome has between 90 to 95% interception success. And then here comes that 5%, right? This is what 5% looks like. 5% is that one time when the rocket's going to slip through the net. And it's absolutely tragic. I went to the Shiva briefly of the family here in Rehovot that was, it's being held right now for this 82-year-old woman. Breaks my heart, beyond any description, that this is how she ended her life. It shook people up. People were not expecting it. But Rehovot is a resilient city. If you go now to the main street, you'll see it is completely bustling. It's not any emptier than usual. And they did not break Rehovot spirit. But yes, people were shaken up. People were traumatized by the fact that the rocket got through. And that's, this is how rocket terrorism works. You only need one out of 1,500 to get through. You only need one casualty out of, hundreds of thousands of people targeted. And this is how the terrorism works. This is what it's really aimed at doing. It's aimed at, it does what it says on the tin. It's terrorizing. So this fusion, between the dry statistic that I work with as a military analyst and then seeing the result of that as a local resident was, jarring. I guess that's the word I would use to describe it. Because on the one hand, Iron Dome is an absolutely incredible system. It has no equivalent in the world. These capabilities are absolutely phenomenal, and they're about to get much better because the laser system is going to be coming online. And we can talk about that if you like a little later. But on the other hand, just the fact that we're still under rocket attack, the problem and the threats to the morale of the people, in addition to the safety, still exists, and it's still something that we have to deal with on a regular basis.
Yeah. So just talk me through this. Do you view this latest operation, Shield and Arrow, do you view it as a success?
So I think before answering that question, let's talk about what it was meant to do. Okay, because I was speaking, to the military throughout the operation, and they were extremely clear, okay, to their credit, about what this military operation was designed to do and what it was not designed to do. So the goal that they themselves, the IDF, set for itself is to restore stability to southern Israel, because what triggered this operation, this surprise strike, which really did stun PIJ, sort of a local version of shock and awe, was the fact that a Palestinian Islamic Jihad hunger striker had basically committed suicide, starved himself to death after 86 days of refusing food. And PIJ decided that it was going to punish Israel for this, and it terrorized the Sderot area with a surprise barrage of 102 rockets as kids were coming home from school. Okay, so Israel responded, very mildly against Hamas, and people were extremely critical. I was one of them about that response. And behind the scenes, what was cooking was an operation to surprise PIJ, get it to put its guard down, to think that the escalation was over, to map out who was in charge of its rocket division, where they were staying at all times, 24 hours a day, and then deliver this surprise strike. Now, the strike, I think, we have to take a minute to understand what the Israeli Air Force and the Israeli intelligence community did here. It struck 3 separate PIJ commanders in 3 different locations in the space of 3 seconds. These are people who use their own families as human shields. So they were waiting for the moment when the least amount of harm could be caused to those around them. Mm-hmm. That's what the IDF was aiming for. And it killed 3 of the people who make up the PIJ's leadership in Gaza at the same time. There was no response from PIJ for almost 36 hours because it was stunned. It was stunned by the strike, and it took it time to recover. And then what happened was PIJ did what it knows how to do best, which is flood southern Israel and to a certain degree central Israel with rockets. That was a predictable response. The IDF knew that was what was coming. It had deployed Iron Dome, it had deployed its Air Force, and it gradually began picking off more and more targets. And doing so, with a level of intelligence and precise firepower that, in my view, simply doesn't exist anywhere else. We're talking about the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, used as one big human shield by this Iranian-funded terrorist army. And this job of finding the needle in the haystack in real time and finding the right munition and knowing when to strike and when not to strike. Lots of strikes were aborted to avoid harming Palestinian civilians. This was the goal of the operation, was to top up Israeli deterrence against Palestinian Islamic Jihad and to leave Hamas on the side in order to not turn this into a larger escalation. So did the IDF achieve its goal? This is a very limited goal. Again, I stress, restore a degree of stability to the south, restore Israeli deterrence vis-a-vis PIJ, and end it quickly. That was the IDF's goal in this operation. It achieved its goal. I think that's undeniable. So the real question is this the right goal? And that, I think, is where the discussion is much wider. Is this the right goal to set? So I think, that's a very difficult question to answer, because there are a lot of voices, and I believe you're one of them, who is critical of these limited goals, who believes that they are too limited. And that's a completely valid, I think, criticism. But I think at the same time that when you look at Israel's wider strategic threats, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iranian nuclear program, the Iranian missile program, Iran's attempt to take over Syria, and the West Bank, which is becoming increasingly unstable. When you put all these things together, you have to ask yourself the question: is this the time? And I know you don't like, that question, and rightly so. But is this the time to get involved in a major war in the Gaza Strip? Is this the time? And I think that the answer to that question is no. It's not the right time. That time may come. It may well come. But I don't think this is the right time. So if there's a way of knocking PIJ down to size without getting involved in a major Gazan war, I would support that course of action as the least worst. It's not a great alternative, but the least worst alternatives in terms of what's on the menu right now. That's how I view it.
So what makes you think that I'm one of the folks who believes that this is not a sufficient position for the Israeli defense establishment and the Israeli government to take?
The last webinar that you held right here at the MirYam Institute, I listened to it intently afterwards, and you expressed, very eloquently your objection to this approach. So did I get it right?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say that you're correct. I don't believe that this is sufficient at all. I think that there are a number of problems that have happened. So first of all, let's put credit forward where credit is due. The idea that the Israel Defense Forces is able to eliminate, to kill in a targeted and precise manner 3 of the senior brass of Palestinian Islamic Jihad across a time span of 3 seconds, so more or less simultaneously, is incredible. It's an incredible military achievement. I believe that there should be more. I think that there should be a stronger emphasis on the use and deployment of targeted killings. I'll give you an example of where I would like to see that policy in the forefront of Israel's toolkit, or at the top of Israel's toolkit, if I can put it that way. I don't think it should only be limited to situations, or generally be limited to situations, where Palestinian Islamic Jihad fires 100 rockets at the state of Israel because a prisoner decides to starve himself to death. I don't think that it should be a response to that. I think that this should be a constant proactive policy of the Israeli defense establishment and of the Israeli government to eliminate senior threats that mean us harm, and in order to prevent them coming to the decision that now is the time to launch hostilities against the state of Israel. You remove them, you of course remove their decision-making process as well. And I think that that's something that I would like to see happen more frequently, not less frequently. Having said that, the targeted killing of 3 such individuals is a brilliant maneuver by the Israeli defense establishment, and something in which I think all of us can take a great deal of pride. And I think that we saw the effectiveness of that, Yaakov, when we saw that drawn out period of an almost a pregnant inaction in terms of retaliation to those targeted killings by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which basically demonstrated to anyone who was watching that in fact the targeted killing of these leaders does indeed push a terror organization in its entirety onto the back foot. It throws them off balance. It eliminates much of their planning. It eliminates much of their strategy. And as I said, I think we've all borne witness to that. However, there is a terrible danger that Israel is now in violation of one of its key declarations and one of its key policies. And I'll give a little bit of context to this. You recall, of course, when the Assad regime was releasing chemical weapons against its own civilians. Do you remember that?
Of course.
Okay. And do you remember that there was a president of the United States who made a statement about the deployment of chemical weapons?
Yes, indeed.
And who was that president?
Barack Obama.
Barack Obama. And President Barack Obama more or less said that if, and I'm paraphrasing now, but he more or less said, if the United States sees a whole bunch of chemical weapons being moved around, that would be a game changer in the calculus of the United States of America. And he went on to say that that would constitute what, Yaakov? It would constitute a red line.
Red line crossing. That was
exactly,
it. Yeah.
a red line in the viewpoint of the United States of America. In other words, that they could no longer stay out of what was basically, unfortunately, a terrible internal civil war within Syria. And you remember all of this at least as well as I remember this.
Sure.
And ultimately what happened was, despite that statement by Barack Obama, Assad went on to release chemical weapons against his own people. And the response by Barack Obama was basically nothing. Nothing. He was thrown a little bit of a helping hand from the Russians as a consequence of a throwaway comment that was made by then Secretary of State John Kerry when America was ramping up its readiness to strike Syria in a way that they defined as a pinpoint strike against specific sites in Syria. So telegraphing the fact that they didn't mean to bring about anything too heavy-handed, and basically the Syrians need not fear, or the Syrian regime need not fear for its life, because they would not be targeted. And as Kerry went on this campaign to bring about public opinion to the side of that policy, he was asked by somebody in the press, is there anything that could be done to avert this strike by the United States of America against Syria? And he retorted and responded in a very off-the-cuff, loose manner, because he didn't place any faith in the notion. He retorted that, yes, if they were to hand over all of their weapons and disarm completely and so on and so forth. And then he completed that statement by saying, but that's not going to happen. Now, I'm paraphrasing somewhat, but that you remember this exchange.
Sure.
And then out of nowhere, one Vladimir Putin happens to hear this off-the-cuff comment from John Kerry and says, you know what, I'll have that. I'll have it that. I'll have a go at doing that, and I will disarm the Syrians of their chemical weapons capabilities, and let me do that. And then there's certain
this is before, I think, the Russians essentially became Assad's air force and knocked down, a chunk of northern Syria against the rebel forces, practicing the war crimes that they were going to continue later on European soil in the Ukraine.
And exactly, as I said earlier, you remember all of this just as well as I remember it. And what that did was it actually took the teeth out of American declarations when it came to many a listener around and throughout the international community. By the way, no shortage of whom came from this region of the world, the Middle East, who looked at statements by an American president and said, these statements have no teeth. And what we're left with is basically an America with a mouth filled with gums and nothing else. And now I come to the issue of Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The fact of the matter is that when we look at the threat emanating from southern Lebanon, specifically that which is in the hands of Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy, nothing less than an Iranian proxy, the state of Israel has said many a time since the Second Lebanon War, specifically in 2006. So this is a declaration that has been reiterated since 2006, that in the event of another round against Hezbollah, or in the event that the state of Israel faces a sustained bombardment by Hezbollah onto Israeli sovereign territory, the Israel Defense Forces, by order of the Israeli government, will hold not Hezbollah responsible, but the sovereign of Lebanon, namely the Lebanese government, responsible. And that as a consequence of that, Lebanon would face the full brunt of Israel's response and retaliation. And many believe that that stated policy, which, by the way, is heavily criticized by the international community, but I'm not interested in what the international community has to say on that particular issue.
We have to deal with that too, by the way, that front too.
We have to deal with that front, but you know what? You can only deal with it if you live long enough to do so. Right? You can only deal with it if you live long enough to do so. And so if you allow...
I don't see any contradiction
Right. If you
can
allow a
do both.
bombardment of 120,000 rockets upon your homeland and you allow it and you don't push back against it, as I know you would never want to see happen, I know your views, I believe, on these sorts of issues, then you may not be in a position to respond to the international community or to bring the international community sentiments to your side.
Mhm.
First of all, you have to fight back and put out the source of the fire. Now, many
100%.
believe that stated policy of the Israeli government has served as a deterrent, not only to Hezbollah, but also to Lebanon and to others. Now take that picture and transpose it onto the Gaza Strip. And I know that these are not one and the same, but there are similarities that are borne out upon scrutiny. Number one, here you have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a proxy of Iran, just like Hezbollah is the proxy of Iran, firing rockets indiscriminately toward the state of Israel, including onto your hometown, tragically. And the sovereign, if I can put it in those terms, the sovereign of the Gaza Strip is not the state of Israel, and it's not Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It is Hamas. Hamas 100%. Is the sovereign of the Gaza Strip. And yet we have allowed ourselves to give Hamas a pass. And we have basically said to Hamas, so long as you do not engage in this firefight, you will not be touched. You will not be harmed. You will not be toppled. And therefore, the broader populace will not be inconvenienced, disruptive, had their lives become much more difficult because of damage to infrastructure and so on and so forth, not because of the mass casualties of civilians, which is something that we know does not happen when Israel fires back. But inconveniences, certainly, difficulties and hardships, certainly. There's a whole reason that I think that is actually the responsibility of the Gazan people, not of the state of Israel or the Israel Defense Forces, incidentally, but that's a bit of a digression. And here we are saying to Lebanon, watch out, because if the Iranian proxy in your territory should act up against us, we're going to punish you. But we're saying to Hamas, you need not watch out, because if your little Iranian proxy should rear its head and start firing upon us, as long as you don't join arms with them and link arms with them, we're going to leave you alone. And what do they do while they're being left alone? What does the sovereign in the Gaza Strip do as it's being left alone? Does it disarm? Does it reach out to the state of Israel? It does not do any such thing.
Not a chance.
It continues to arm up to the teeth. It continues to strengthen itself. It continues to plan. It continues to coordinate. It continues to foment increasing dangers for us over in Judea and Samaria, where they're growing in popularity, and where, by the way, the Israel Defense Forces is facing a lot of criticism now for unnecessary activities in those areas. And I just feel that carte blanche, unfortunately, has been given to a sworn enemy of the state of Israel, the people of Israel, and Jewish people wherever they may be. And I'm referring here specifically to Hamas. And unfortunately, whatever the numbers may be of the rockets that were fired from the Gaza Strip by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they will be insignificant compared to when next Hamas decides to bombard the state of Israel, as we know, and we will be responsible for them being able to do so from a fortified, stronger, and more potent position. So yes, I'm against it.
Okay. And that's a perfectly legitimate perspective. Now let me challenge it by, and we're not talking about science here. We're talking about messaging, we're talking about deterrence, and we're talking about strategy. And none of those things are precise scientific endeavors, right? So we are talking about assessments, how things are perceived on the other side by adversaries, by people living under them, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, first of all, I think all of us in this discussion have to be modest, because what looks like deterrence one day can turn around. We've seen this already with Hamas so many times. We say it's deterred, but when they feel the need to fire, rockets at Jerusalem to prove a point, they were not deterred from firing those rockets. So we have to talk about deterrence with modesty and all of these issues with modesty. So putting that on the table as one. I would argue on the flip side that the message from Israel to Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to Hamas, and to Hezbollah, despite the inconsistencies that you've identified are actually one and the same, that they're all one and the same message. And I'll tell you why. When Israel tells Lebanon it will be held responsible for what Hezbollah does, Israel knows very well that it's talking essentially to a fictitious entity. The Lebanese government has no control over what Hezbollah does or doesn't do. The Lebanese government has no control over southern Lebanon at all. Southern Lebanon is a Hezbollah administered basically state within a state. And of course, Hezbollah is also involved in the Lebanese government. It's the dominant faction there. But really, anything from the border and right up to southern Beirut is Hezbollah land. So who are we talking to when we make this kind of messaging? We're talking, in my view, to Hezbollah. That's the target audience. And what we're telling Hezbollah is, if you initiate a war with Israel, you are going to bring destruction on the whole of Lebanon. And is that message going to deter Hezbollah when the day comes? We don't know. This is where the modesty comes in. We don't know. But that's how I interpret the message. It's not really addressed at the Lebanese government because it's not a real government. In fact, Lebanon is not a real state. If you look at, the definition of a state, the most basic definition, monopoly of arms, Hamastan is more of a state than Lebanon. The largest army in Lebanon is not the Lebanese army, so that can't be a real state. Now, this operation was a message, I think, to all of them. And what Israel is saying is, look, this is a small-scale conflict. We all know that. But what we did to PIJ, coming out of nowhere and killing them in their homes, killing these people in their homes as they slept in their beds, we can do that, Israel is saying, to any one of you, Hamas, Hezbollah, people, working for Iran across the Middle East. This marriage of intelligence and firepower, precise firepower, has no real limits in this region. There's no border that it stops here. It can be applied anywhere. And I think that was the message that Israel sent to everybody. Now, will it work? Is it the right thing to do? Your guess, your perspective, you might well be right, Benjamin. Maybe it won't work. Maybe the fact that we gave Hamas a free pass, as you say correctly, maybe that will blow up in our face and we'll live to regret that. But on the flip side, maybe Hamas, behind its bravado and behind its propaganda is holding meetings now saying, wait a second, PIJ was decimated in this round. We need to think twice before we fire another rocket at Israel. Maybe something has changed over there. And maybe if we, escalate, we could end up facing this kind of preemptive attack as well. And all we can do, I think, is be open to the fact that this could be interpreted in different ways by the adversary and to let time prove which theory ends up being correct. So that's the one thing I would say. The other thing is, you touched on the dynamic between Hamas and PIJ. And here's where I think things get really interested because, as a military analyst and somebody who thinks about strategy all day, I'm always fascinated when there's a very big gap, when I at least think that I'm seeing a very big gap between the public messaging and what's really going on. And I think with Hamas and PIJ, it's one of the biggest examples of that gap in play. I think Hamas was not at all upset by the fact that PIJ was getting decimated in Gaza. Not at all upset. I think it was secretly quite pleased. And the reason I think that is because PIJ is a threat to Hamas. It's a threat to it. And Hamas, ever since it became, in addition to being a terrorist organization, which is run honestly by a bunch of terrorist thugs. Okay, there's no way of looking at it, in a nicer manner. These are murderous fundamentalists, but they're also a government. They have a new hat. Okay, they're running the lives of 2.3 million people, and they're not stupid. They can't ignore the fact that they have responsibilities towards this population, and that if they drag it into war every year, they're going to end up losing this regime, which is so important for them. So Hamas has an ability to be pragmatic, not in the long-term strategic sense. In the long-term strategic sense, they're utterly committed to Israel's destruction, and that's what motivates all of their actions. But in the short-term tactical manner, they can display pragmatism. And they think that PIJ is an impulsive, upstart, for lack of a better word, that just, has no responsibility, no civilian responsibility. It has no considerations other than achieving its goal of jihad against Israel. And they are furious at PIJ for starting escalations all of the time. And there's no clear way to demonstrate that anger than by sitting out on the sidelines. And again, in these kinds of situations, I say, look at what Hamas does. Don't look at what it says. It sat out on the side and let Israel target PIJ with one deadly strike after another. Now, when this escalation came to an end, Ziad al-Nakhaleh, who's the PIJ Secretary General, most of the time he's in Beirut. He's also in Damascus, and he's enjoying the Iranian bankroll, staying in fancy hotels. This is a man who could care less about the people of Gaza. He could care less about the sun. So at the end of this escalation, al-Nakhaleh is giving a speech in which he, says, yes, we've lost, we're in mourning, we've lost many of our people, but this is a victory. We terrorized Israel, all the usual propaganda talking points. And then he starts thanking people. He's thanking Iran, he's thanking Hezbollah. And you can take one guess, and I'm sure when you come back on screen, you will make this guess. Who did he thank? Who did he not thank? Sorry. So the PIJ chief did not thank Hamas. Okay, and that's because PIJ and Hamas are absolutely furious at one another. PIJ is taking away the mantle of the leader of the so-called resistance, which is another way. Resistance to what, by the way? This is not resistance to occupation or to Israeli policy. This is resistance to Israel's existence. PIJ is saying, we are the leader now of this so-called resistance access, and Hamas, it's accusing Hamas of turning into another Fatah. This is exactly, by the way, what Hamas did to Fatah during the days of the Second Intifada and before. It was the one that was telling Fatah, you have become traitors to the Palestinian cause, and you're so pragmatic now that we can't consider you a resistance faction. And now PIJ is doing exactly the same to Hamas. Now, PIJ and Hamas are both, again, I'm going to stress this because it's important, and I think that not enough people in the world understand this. PIJ and Hamas are fundamentalist organizations that are utterly and authentically and genuinely committed to the long-term goal of destroying the state of Israel. And we must never, ever forget that. But that doesn't mean that we have to be in a state of total and constant war with both of them at the same time. If there's a way to get them confronting one another and raising tensions between these two terror organizations, then that, in my opinion, is strategically wise, especially if it frees us up to deal with more pressing and important arenas, which I believe we need to do in the next year and a half. So those are just some of my thoughts.
So I want to continue this. I just want to check, is my audio still clear, Yaakov? Can you hear me?
Yes,
is there
absolutely.
background noise or anything that's, and the Wi-Fi is still okay? I've had to relocate. So
perfectly clear.
I find all of that very, very interesting, and I don't mean that in a condescending manner. I understand the calculus that you're analyzing and the one that you're putting forward, but the problems that I see are as follows. First of all, given the point that you made about Lebanon not necessarily being a country that can even be viewed as a state that is intact these days during this time and this period, the reality is that while Lebanon does still have standing on the map as an independent state, according to anybody who would look at a map, Hamas continues to enjoy this incarnation of not ruling over a state proper, not quite being a sovereign because they're a non-state actor in an area which many people say the state of Israel still exerts control over, and so on and so forth. And right. The truth of the matter is that if Israel is going to make statements towards a state, Lebanon, that's not really a state, aimed at a sovereign, the Lebanese government that's not really a government, then surely it should double down on the severity and the seriousness and the meaning of its declarations towards Gaza, and specifically towards Hamas, who are a sovereign, who are having an impact, who are ruling over territory.
Yeah, fair
And
point.
and
Fair
that's the
point.
first issue. So whatever we say, it should not be that because we don't really believe that there's anybody listening or receiving the message over in Lebanon, that we should therefore feel comfortable not relaying that message over to the
Yeah.
folks in the Gaza Strip. By the way,
There
we
is
have
somebody listening in
repeatedly,
Lebanon, by the way. It's just I don't think it's who claiming the target audience is. It's
but we've
Hezbollah.
also we've repeatedly said this to the government of Hamas.
100%.
We've
Yeah, that's a
repeatedly
fair
said
point.
to
Yeah.
Hamas, if there is anything that emanates from the Gaza Strip, we are going to hold you responsible. That's the first
Absolutely.
point.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so we
Mhm.
seem to have been defanged, if I can use that. We seem to be somewhat toothless, gone in the mouth a little bit when it comes
Mhm.
to our statements, in my opinion. And the second point that I would
Fair
say
point.
is that
Mhm.
the rockets that will come to us when Hamas sees it fit and deems it fit to
Mhm.
launch a strike toward Israel, against Israel, well, those will be, as I mentioned before, more numerous, more dangerous, with greater trajectories. And I feel that we will be in some way responsible for that. And we cannot surely allow for a repeat of what we've seen in southern Lebanon to take place now in the Gaza Strip, namely that a non-state actor that masquerades as a non-state actor
Mhm.
enjoys the freedom of armament and further armament and further armament until such time as it feels comfortable to unleash the full force of that armament on Israel and on Israel's cities and on Israel's civilians. And that's what we're going to do, Yaakov, if we don't end up having some sort of preemptive strike against Hamas's capabilities, or at the very least, holding Hamas to account, as we say we will do when the time
Mhm.
comes. And I believe the time has just come during the operation of Shield and Arrow. I think that was an opportune moment to strike at Hamas's capabilities as well. And I think that we have missed that opportunity. And the reason that I think that we missed that opportunity is when we talk about deterrence, yes, we should speak about deterrence with humility, as you said. But I actually believe, and this is not the first time I've said this, it's not just that we have lost our deterrence powers against those in the Gaza Strip. It's actually that we ourselves, unfortunately, we have become deterred. We seem to
Mhm.
be the party that is deterred. We seem to be the party that is not willing to take decisive action. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And I believe we will rue the day when we allowed
Mhm.
our sworn enemy, Hamas, to continue to arm, to rearm, to prepare, to train, and to ready itself for an attack at a time of its choosing against Israeli citizens. I just think that we will look back on this and say, what an error. While we were decapitating terrorist leaders, why did we not decapitate those leaders of Hamas?
All fair points, Benjamin. Really, I mean, again, because we're not discussing science and mathematics, we're discussing strategy and deterrence and short-term objective versus long-term interests. I think that, your perspective is simply just as valid as mine, and we only will know with time whether this will indeed be seen, as you say, to have been a major missed opportunity, or whether we were smart to prioritize other things which are more pressing, which are larger. The reason I keep coming back to this, by the way, about this issue of prioritization is, if I view the state of Israel like an organization and it's got
Mhm.
X amount of resources and X amount of time, and it's got X amount of security threats, I honestly believe that Gaza is right, despite the fact that it's a disturbing and problematic threat. I think it's way down on the list. Iran, I'll remind everybody, is the furthest along it's ever been in its nuclear program. Israel may have to take action in the very not distant future against Iran. Hezbollah has, according to some assessments, 1,000 precision guided missiles. And its arsenal, as you correctly noted, is on a different scale to anything that can be compared to the Gaza Strip. If we are able to prioritize the northern and Iranian conventional and unconventional threats and to keep Gaza on a low flame, I think we should do that, because I would always rather take on enemies one at a time rather than all at once. And even though Iran is trying to create this multiple arena threat where it can set up challenges for us of this ring of fire from Gaza, from Lebanon, from Syria, from the West Bank. And by the way, we should note that one of the PIJ people who was killed at the opening strike, he was working on setting up rocket firing capabilities from the West Bank. So if we can take on enemies one at a time, I think that that's a preferable situation. Or if we need to take on multiple enemies, then at least it's done at a time when we deem it to serve our strategic and operational interests. And I don't think that getting into a large-scale war in Gaza right now would serve those interests. But again, I say all of this with a great deal of humility, because I think the larger picture will only become clearer with time. There's one more thing I wanted to touch on, which you mentioned about weapons production. And you said that every day that Hamas have, and you're absolutely right, they use to produce rockets. I don't know if they have 15 or 20,000 rockets in their inventory, and they're building those rockets. And Israel is building ever increasingly capable air defenses. We're going to get laser systems on board within approximately a year and a half. And within, approximately 4.5 years, we're going to have laser interceptors over Gaza as well. These are laser systems that we put on drones, large drones. So you're going to get rockets that are intercepted in Gazan airspace eventually, before they even cross into Israel. Now let's look at this. The tunnel threat is gone. Thank God, and thanks to the Israeli defense establishment's ingenuity of building a very deep underground wall, which cut those tunnels and stopped the ability of Gazan terror factions to tunnel. Everybody was talking about tunnels. Tunnels was the thing.
Yeah, of course.
Tunnels are gone. They are gone. Okay, and now we're trying to build a wall like this for the projectile aerial threat. And I don't know how far we're going to come with that. We've already come a long way, but the fact that they're able to terrorize and shut down the country means we're nowhere near where we need to be. If in the not too distant future, with the help of laser technology, backed up by Iron Dome, backed up by airstrikes, we are able to deal with Gaza without sending ground forces, which is the only way to stop weapons production. The only way to stop an enemy from producing weapons is to control the territory that enemy is on. There's no other way. Putting that on the table. That's why we have not had rockets from the West Bank, from Judea and Samaria, because the IDF is there every single night with the Shin Bet. We have very, very good control of that arena. In Gaza, we have no ground presence.
By the way, Yaakov, that's not the only reason. Just to interject for a moment, it's not just because the IDF is able to operate there with a free hand, and it does so day and night necessarily. It's also because there was a very protracted, determined, serious, and far-reaching and far-ranging military operation that took daring and heavy sacrifice.
Operation Defensive Shield.
Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, and it was necessary, it was needed, and it was effective.
Right, but it never really ended. Do you know what I mean? We haven't really ever left. I mean,
but we've also never had, we have had a massive reduction of suicide or homicide bombings against the Israeli population, because it came accompanied with the building of the barrier, of the security barrier. And we have not had rocket fire emanating from there. And I think that on balance, one can look at that and say that is a better security. Let's put aside the diplomatic quandary.
Of course.
It's a better security situation than preceded Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. I don't know that one can say that we're in a better security situation now than we were prior, for example, to the disengagement. I know there are some voices that say so. For example, Yair Golan, who's the former deputy chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, says so very, very clearly. But
I don't think far fewer deaths. Yeah,
pardon me?
Says. It depends. He talks about the fact that there's just far fewer casualties.
Right, and I just don't think I just don't think that it's that clear cut. And just to go back to an earlier point that you made, I'm well aware, and I think most people are aware of the fact that the state of Israel faces multiple threats emanating from multiple fronts with varying degrees of potency. in terms of the threats that we face at any given time. But my response to that is defang and get rid of the smaller threats while you can. Get rid of those smaller threats while you can. Do your best, at least, to downgrade those threats while you can, because I will tell you that if we face a situation where the Gaza Strip should be the launch pad again for massive rocket bombardments against the State of Israel at the hands of Hamas, and Iran has nuclear capabilities at that time, we're going to be very, very, very limited in terms of what we're able to do and not do in response to that. So too goes for southern Lebanon with regard to Hezbollah as well. So I just think you need to not look at things and say, this is a lower priority threat, let's leave it, but rather say, this is less of a threat, let's get rid of it.
Right. But when you say get rid of it, see, this is where I say, well, what does that mean? Let's break that down. And can we simply get rid of it through air power? I don't believe that we can. Okay. Degrading, by the way, is a different word. I can certainly get behind the idea of degrading. And I have a lot of sympathy to the argument that we should have also struck Hamas during this latest escalation. I'm highly sympathetic to that claim. All I'm saying is we are never going to get rid of the rocket threat in Gaza permanently through air power. I don't believe that's possible, as incredible as and precise as the air power is. Only a ground operation can defang the Gaza Strip. And I think there's a good reason, very good reason, not to get involved, not to get stuck in the Gazan mud at this time. I think it's a trap. I think it's an enormous Iranian-sponsored trap. I don't think Iran would want anything more than for the IDF to focus its resources, its attention in a major Gazan war, which would take our eyes, in my opinion, off the ball that's developing and coming at us pretty quickly, both from Iranian territory and from the north. So that's my personal view. You know, if we're talking about degrading, I could get behind that. If we're talking about eliminating the threat, I think without a ground operation and occupying the Gaza Strip, it's simply not possible.
Well, Yaakov, I don't really know that we're going to agree on this point on this call or during this conversation.
I'm sympathetic to your perspective, just to be clear.
And I am to yours as well. And I greatly appreciate everything that you're saying and that which you mean. And I appreciate your expertise. I think that we'll have to rest at agreeing to disagree. It won't be the first time that we've done that, but to do so, obviously, with a point of great deference and respect to one another, as I certainly extend to you. There were so many 100%. Other things that I wanted to speak about during this conversation, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do so just because of the limits of time. So I want to, first of all, tell you that I'm very, very pleased that you're recovering from what must have been a very difficult time. I know well, having lived here and returning to live here, I know very, very well the pervasive atmosphere that befalls the state of Israel in wartime. It's not something that is removed as soon as the guns fall silent, but it does pass.
Very true.
And I want to wish you and your family and everybody here much safety and much peace and much quiet, much deserved quiet now for a very protracted period of time. And if this latest operation should bring that about for a large extended period, then I will say that it was largely successful. Hopefully that will be the case. We'll wait and see. But for now,
good to have you back here in Israel, Benjamin. Great to have you back here. Thanks, Yaakov.
It's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to getting together with you in person. And thank you very, very much for your time. And thanks to my colleagues at the MirYam Institute. And thanks for those who've listened to us today. I look forward to the next time.
Thanks.
Take care, Yaakov. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.